Rothenburg ob der Tauber, Bavaria. The last week of March, 1945. Dawn breaks pink and gold over a skyline that has not changed in 500 years. The same crenellated walls, the same red-tiled roof stacked like a child's toy village, the same crooked half-timbered houses leaning companionably into narrow cobbled lanes. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American artillery crews are consulting maps and adjusting range tables. This medieval jewel, untouched by the industrial age, sits directly in the path of General Alexander Patch's 7th Army. Inside the town hall, a 62-year-old bureaucrat named Oscar Schmidt is doing arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with survival. He is the Burgermeister of Rothenburg, a man whose job until recently involved little more than road repairs, tax collection, and the mundane friction of small-town administration. Now he holds, however briefly, the fate of one of Europe's most perfectly preserved medieval towns in his hands. Around him, a small circle of officials and one uneasy military commander are wrestling with a question that thousands of German civic leaders would face in the spring of 1945 in 10,000 towns and villages across a collapsing Reich: obey the order to fight to the last man or find some way, anyway, to make the war simply stop happening to your particular street. This is not a story about tanks or generals or grand strategy. It is a story about the terrifying vulnerability of ordinary administrators caught between a regime that demanded suicidal resistance and an invading army that had, by 1945, learned to flatten anything that resisted it. It matters because it shows, in miniature, how the Third Reich actually ended. Not always in a blaze of fanatical last stands, but often in the quiet, desperate improvisation of men who had never expected to make decisions of historical consequence, and who chose, at considerable personal risk, to disobey. By March 1945, Adolf Hitler's standing orders were unambiguous and absolute. Every town, every village, every crossroads was to be defended to the last bullet and the last man. Commanders who surrendered without a fight faced summary execution, so increasingly did the mayors and officials who might encourage them to do so. The Nazi Party's regional enforcers, the Kreisleiter, answerable directly to Berlin, had wide powers to override local civilian and even military authority and a documented willingness to use them. Roving courts-martial, the so-called flying tribunals, hanged suspected defeatists from lampposts and left placards on their chests reading "coward" or "traitor." In towns across Germany that spring, mayors and sometimes just outspoken citizens were killed for suggesting that resistance was pointless. For Rothenburg specifically, the calculation was uniquely brutal. This was not an industrial town whose destruction might be dismissed as a wartime necessity. It was, and had been for a century, one of the most visited historical sites in Germany. A town that had somehow escaped the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic campaigns, and the First Industrial Age with its medieval fabric essentially intact. Its walls dated to the 13th and 14th centuries. Its town hall, its churches, its market square, had survived 700 years of European catastrophe. Whatever happened here in the next 72 hours would either preserve that unbroken chain or end it permanently, in an afternoon, with a handful of artillery batteries doing in hours what plague, fire, and successive wars had failed to do in 7 centuries. The military situation offered no comfort. 7th Army's advance through Franconia in late March 1945 had been rapid and, where resistance appeared, punishing. American doctrine by this stage of the war was straightforward. Where a defended position slowed the advance, artillery and air power were used liberally to remove the obstacle, civilian architecture notwithstanding. Dozens of German towns that chose or were forced by fanatical local commanders to resist had already been reduced to rubble that spring. A foretaste of exactly what awaited Rothenburg if its garrison chose to make a stand behind those beautiful, utterly indefensible medieval walls. The town had no meaningful strategic value. It commanded no river crossing, no rail junction, no industrial capacity worth the name. It would be destroyed, if it were destroyed, for nothing but Nazi doctrine and a handful of infantry positions. Schmidt was not, by most accounts, a natural revolutionary. He was a career civil servant, and by 1945 he had already spent years navigating the suffocating demands of a totalitarian state while trying to keep his town's ordinary business functioning. But the calculus facing him and his fellow officials that week left almost no room for administrative caution. The Nazi military commander, then present in the town, accounts differ slightly on precise composition, but a local garrison under a determined defender was preparing positions consistent with Hitler's standing orders, represented one path: entrenchment, token resistance, and near-certain devastation. Schmidt and a number of like-minded local figures represented the other, a search for any means to have the town declared in effect undefended so that American forces would have no pretext to bombard it. The technical and human innovation here was not a weapon. It was an act of persuasion under threat of death, a specific, personal, high-stakes negotiation that had to happen without radios, treaties, or any of the normal apparatus of surrender. It required convincing a military commander to defy a Führer order that carried an explicit death penalty for exactly the kind of leniency being requested. It required simultaneously finding some way to signal to the advancing Americans that the town would not fight, in an era before any of the modern conventions for exactly that kind of communication were standard practice, and while American gunners had every operational reason to assume the opposite. What is well documented is this. The local military commander overseeing Rothenburg's defense in the final days of March, under sustained pressure from civic officials including Schmidt, ultimately withdrew the bulk of his forces from the town rather than fight inside it, in direct contravention of the fight-to-the-death order then in force. This was an act that could have seen him shot by any passing SS unit or flying court-martial before the Americans ever arrived. Separately, the American commander directing the assault on the sector, Major General Jack Hayes, is recorded as having received a personal appeal, reportedly reinforced by direct intervention from the 7th Army's overall commander, General Alexander Patch, who was said to have known and admired the town from pre-war travels, asking that Rothenburg be spared bombardment if it would not be defended. Whatever the precise chain of communication, the practical outcome by the very end of March was an agreement, however informal and fragile, that American guns would hold their fire if German resistance did not materialize. The town was not entirely spared damage. American artillery fire on the outskirts and against the walls in the days before the final agreement is well documented, and Rothenburg's fortifications and some structures did suffer bomb and shell damage in the last days of March 1945. But the wholesale destruction inflicted on towns that fought, or whose garrisons remained entrenched to the end, did not happen here. American forces entered Rothenburg on April 17, 1945, without the block-by-block devastation seen elsewhere in Franconia that spring. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The contrast with towns that did resist is stark and well recorded. Würzburg, less than 80 kilometers away, was subjected to a devastating air raid on March 16, 1945 that destroyed the overwhelming majority of its historic center in a single night, killing several thousand civilians. Nuremberg, the spiritual home of Nazi Party rallies and consequently a target of particular symbolic importance, was reduced to ruins across multiple raids before finally falling in early April 1945 after brutal house-to-house fighting that leveled its own genuinely ancient old town. Aschaffenburg's garrison commander fought a fanatical, unauthorized defense into April 1945 that left the town devastated for no discernible strategic gain. Across Franconia and Bavaria that spring, the pattern repeats. Towns where local Nazi Party officials or fanatical garrison commanders enforced Hitler's order suffered catastrophic destruction. Towns where civilian officials or pragmatic commanders found a way to signal non-resistance were far more likely to survive largely intact. The comparison with how German civic authority elsewhere handled the same dilemma is instructive too. Not every mayor who wished to save his town succeeded, and not every attempt was as fortunate in its outcome. Many local officials who suggested surrender to approaching Allied forces were denounced, and some were executed by Nazi Party fanatics or roaming military police units before any negotiation could be completed. Rothenburg's outcome depended on a fragile, almost accidental alignment: a military commander willing to risk defiance, American commanders willing to exercise restraint they were under no obligation to show, and, crucially, enough speed in the collapse of centralized Nazi authority in that specific pocket of Franconia that no flying court-martial arrived in time to hang the men making these decisions. In towns where that timing broke differently, mayors attempting exactly the same calculation died for it. The psychological dimension of this story is worth pausing on. This was, in the most literal sense, a negotiation for the town's soul carried out under conditions of extreme personal jeopardy, with no guarantee that either side of the improvised bargain would hold. Schmidt and his fellow officials had no way of confirming that American gunners had actually received or would honor instructions to withhold fire. They simply had to act and hope. The military commander who withdrew his forces had no guarantee that doing so would not be reported to Berlin before the Americans arrived, resulting in his own execution regardless of the eventual American occupation. This was improvisation under maximal uncertainty by people whose training and instincts, shaped by a decade of totalitarian conditioning, offered them almost no precedent for this kind of civil courage. The impact of this specific act of preservation has proven remarkably durable in the 8 decades since. Rothenburg ob der Tauber today remains one of the best preserved medieval towns in Europe, its walls walkable in their near entirety, its town hall and churches substantially the buildings Schmidt and his contemporaries were trying to protect in March 1945. It draws millions of visitors annually specifically because of what did not happen there in the war's final weeks. Compare this to Nuremberg's Old Town, painstakingly and expensively reconstructed after the war to resemble what was destroyed, or Würzburg's center, similarly rebuilt from near-total ruin. Rothenburg required no such reconstruction of its historic fabric because the fabric itself survived. It would be wrong to overstate the neatness of this story or to claim more certainty than the historical record supports. Precise details of exactly which official said what to whom, in what order, across those final days of March 1945 are not fully documented, and some popular accounts have doubtless smoothed over genuine ambiguity in the historical record for the sake of a cleaner narrative. What can be said with confidence is that a combination of civic pressure from local officials, including Burgermeister Schmidt, a military commander's decision to withdraw rather than fight, and restraint on the American side together produced an outcome markedly different from the fate of comparable towns nearby. The precise mechanics of persuasion, who convinced whom, and by what argument, remain in places matters of local memory and post-war reconstruction rather than contemporaneous documentation. What this story ultimately illustrates is something larger than one town's survival. It shows the Third Reich's collapse not as a single dramatic event, but as thousands of individual, localized decisions made under conditions of extreme fear and uncertainty, each one a small act of either compliance or defiance. Most such decisions left no lasting monument and are recorded, if at all, only in fragmentary local archives. Rothenburg's survival made its particular decision visible, permanent, and walkable. A town you can stand in today, its walls intact, precisely because a handful of frightened officials chose, in the last days of March 1945, to bet everything on the possibility that defiance might cost them less than compliance. Return for a moment to that dawn in late March, pink and gold over unbroken rooftops. Multiply that dawn by 10,000 towns across a dying Reich, and in the overwhelming majority of them, the calculation broke the other way, toward compliance, toward resistance, toward destruction that served no purpose beyond doctrine. Rothenburg's walls stand today not because it was strategically insignificant, plenty of insignificant towns burned that spring, but because a handful of ordinary men chose, in the space of a few desperate days, to disobey. A mayor with no military authority, a commander with everything to lose, an American general who, for reasons of memory or mercy or simple military pragmatism, chose not to fire. No monument in Rothenburg marks this decision explicitly. It does not need one. The town itself is the monument. Every crooked timber frame, every intact tower, every unbroken stretch of medieval wall, a quiet testament to what a handful of frightened, unheroic men managed to preserve when the alternative was ash. 700 years of European history survived not because it was defended, but because at the final possible moment it was not.